Last time on Still Mormon.
What happens with the happiness letter ultimately?
Yeah, so the happiness letter actually ends up getting added to the history of the church.
Exactly right. Which is so fascinating.
It is.
Because who's the one doing this at the time?
But then you get to the final version of the history, and
Instead of the denial,
the happiness letter is inserted into the history as an addendum without any explanation. What is this? So the question is, where did Richards get this teaching? Did it come from Joseph Smith, or did it come from somewhere else? And was Joseph teaching this publicly or privately?
Coming up, part 3.
there's nothing in the contemporaneous history we can anchor to. So we have these anomalies that pop up. They're all in the handwriting of one guy. I think we ought to stop and pay attention. And I think that's the brilliance of your paper. You're the first person to articulate this pattern, all connected to Willard Richards.
I was in an elders quorum meeting not too long ago where the teacher got up and he's like, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and he found out that I was, a Mormon. And his two questions were, why don't you drink coffee? And how many wives do you have? And everybody in the room just kind of did that awkward,
The nervous chuckle. Yep.
Like, ha, ha, ha.
Mm-hmm.
And that really hit much different to me now
Yes.
than it ever has. That's like we're sitting in elders quorum laughing at this thing that is causing heartache and pain to the women sitting in Relief Society.
This is Still Mormon. The show dedicated to unsettling Mormon history.
All right, so that gets us to the final,
The big kahuna.
the big kahuna, which I think is the culmination of the divine reversal, which is what we now know as Section 132, which is the July 12th, 1843 revelation. So, you can pull out lots of problems with this revelation. To try and connect it to the divine reversal, we have things like this that says, pertaining to the law of the priesthood, if any man espouse a virgin and a desire to espouse another, and the first give her consent, then he is justified. He cannot commit adultery, for they belong unto him, and they are given unto him. Therefore, he is justified. So adultery can be reversed in some instance. And another verse says, I reveal it unto you, my servant Joseph, that then shall you have power by the power of my holy priesthood to take her and give her unto him that hath not committed adultery, but hath been faithful, for he shall be made ruler over many. So
take one woman here.
yeah. So the prophet has the power to reverse and to distribute women, and it's not adultery for anybody who's doing it the right way.
Yeah, they could look at married women. They could, in fact, look at all married women as eligible, which is astonishing.
Yeah.
Because, and they would teach this, that Gentile marriages in particular were not done by proper authority. Therefore, they were no marriages at all. So all women, and this is why so many of them, their first plural wives were married women, because they looked at women who might have been in a bad marriage or whatever. They weren't just widows. They were married women.
Right.
And they would remove them from their families. This is what Heber Kimball did with Sarah Noon. This is what Brigham Young did with Augusta Cobb. I think Lucy Decker was a married woman. All of these men saw this divine reversal as an operating doctrine. It was operational very, very early on.
Yeah. But so the question is, I guess the narrative on D&C 132 is, the standard narrative is that it was received by Joseph on 12th of July, written down by William Clayton, copied by Joseph Kingsbury. Emma destroyed William Clayton's copy. Kingsbury's copy, was with Newell K. Whitney for a little time, and then gave it to Brigham Young at winter quarters and stayed in his desk until 1852. So that's the standard narrative. But so that wouldn't implicate Willard Richards in any way, right? If that narrative is true. But what I discovered I guess I wouldn't say that I discovered any of this, but there's a decent amount of evidence to show that whatever revelation that was being discussed in the Nauvoo Expositor and the High Council meeting in August, there's enough evidence to indicate that maybe what we have now is not the same thing that was being discussed at those times. And these are just a few examples of that evidence. So first off, like I say, the revelation, even though it was received in 1843, it was not made public to anybody until 1852, 8 years later. And we have quotes from Joseph Smith. So in the Nauvoo Expositor, there was 3 affidavits that were claiming these 3 people saw the revelation, and it said, A, B, and C, right? So they declared they saw it, and it said these things. And Joseph Smith, responding to those affidavits in the Expositor, what he said was, the truth of God is transformed into a lie. So he's saying that what they said they saw is different than what I received, right?
And he categorized what the revelation contained.
Right. And then Hiram Smith, in that same I think this was it a city council meeting?
This was the June 8th and 10th meetings of the Nauvoo City Council.
Yeah. So Hiram got up and testified, and he spoke to show us the falsehoods of Austin Cowles, one of the writers of the affidavits and the expositor, in relation to the revelation referred to, that it referred to former days, not the present time, as stated by Cowles. So it implies that there was some sort of revelation that probably talked about marriage in some way, but it's not what Cowles said.
Well, we know Joseph preached probably that revelation on July 16th, 1843, where he got up and he talked about the very same things that he referenced in this meeting. It had to do with a question he had about
levirate marriage.
The levirate marriage, really, in Luke, where the Savior's asked by the Sadducees, well, what happens if a woman die? And a woman, her husband die, and then then she marries her brother, and on up 7 brothers, and they all die. Who's she married to? Right? It was a question about marriage.
Right.
And then the Savior says, well, you don't really understand.
Yeah, he says in heaven, they're not married or given in marriage.
That's right.
So that's the question.
That prompted the idea that to be sealed in heaven, you had to be married by proper authority here. You had to be sealed on earth for it to be sealed in heaven. Interesting. And he said that was the substance of the revelation. They took the truth of God, and they turned it into a lie, polygamy.
Exactly.
And they published that in the paper.
So another piece of evidence. So William Law, another one of the affidavit writers and the creator of the Nauvoo Expositor, later was interviewed, and he said that he remembered distinctly that the revelation was much shorter than what was published as.
And he put those in all caps in the paper.
In the interview
to make it abundantly clear. No, it was much shorter.
Yeah. James Whitehead, who was the secretary to Joseph Smith, he testified in the Temple Lot trial that he also said that it was much shorter and not the same at all. It was entirely changed. And Jason Briggs, who was a member of the RLDS Church, claimed that W.W. Phelps admitted in testimony that the text was produced over 10 or 12 days, and Phelps wrote some of it. Now, some of these are late. Some of them are antagonistic. So I'm not saying that these are all conclusive, but what I am saying is there's enough evidence here that we shouldn't say that the history is settled, that the provenance of the revelation as it stands today may not be that very simple. Joseph received it, William Clayton wrote it.
That's right.
Right.
Ryan Hales has said over and over again that the revelation has excellent provenance, and it actually has no provenance.
Right.
We don't have any clue when pen hit paper. All we have is a story that happens 8 years after the death of the prophet Joseph Smith, and 9 years after the actual supposed reception of the revelation. So the provenance of this document is a story much later. And the question is that story reliable?
Right. Now there's a book just about Section 132 written by, I think he's a friendly source, William Smith.
Yes.
And even he says the nature of the revelation, that is its text and its context, suggests that its present form results from a fusion of several revelations and ideas that developed during Joseph Smith's lifetime. So he is even proposing that it's not just one revelation that was received at one time, that it's a fusion. So is it a possibility that Joseph had a revelation on marriage that was then merged with other things that were being handed around at the time? I think it's a possibility.
And
that
those
we
who
could
look at
discuss.
this objectively, there are different voices in that revelation. They're just tonally.
Oh yeah,
there are distinctly different voices. You don't have to be an expert to notice that. At least is that worth something? And the subject matter changes, and so he is not the only one to opine on this. There's a number of scholars who share that view, especially given the fact that the stories were that Joseph was receiving this as early as 1829, maybe 1828 during the translation of the Book of Mormon. That's Brigham Young. But then we have all these other stories. 1831 is where they kind of settle. So if he received it then how is this a new revelation? And then what about Emma? And what about the stuff about gods? And how do we piece this all together? That's how William V. Smith does it.
Right.
So he says these are multiple revelations, put it into one.
Yeah, and I don't know if he's saying that it was once again, even those multiple revelations, it was received and written at the same time. I don't know how that works.
Yeah,
they're compiled.
William Clayton was saying in his affidavit that, Joseph said, well, I know this by heart. I don't have to get the Urim and Thummim.
Right. Yeah.
So we can explain it a number of ways, I suppose, based on the stories that we want to believe.
Yeah. So I guess, we've kind of a little bit veered off on this tangent of Section 132. So to bring it back, what does this have to do with Willard Richards? That's the subject of the paper, right?
Because he had nothing to do with the story of the original right?
Right. Yeah.
And he didn't include it in the history.
Yeah. I didn't mention his name in that provenance to Brigham Young. Right.
That's
so
right.
what does it have to do with him? So first of all, one thing that we know is that we know there's 4 extant contemporaneous copies of the Revelation. And one of the 4 is in Willard Richards' handwriting. And it includes, paragraph markings, punctuation corrections, alterations, and a notation that says, as altered in pencil, August 7th, 1852. So that indicates that it was being edited less than a month before it was debuted. And I'm kind of...
Explain that phrase.
Which phrase?
EX as altered in pencil. Explain that phrase. That's a very important... This is on the back of the document.
Yeah. So EX means exemplar, right? So this is...
Dan Vogel argues against that. By the time of the airing of this, I will likely have responded, Dan, to your excellent work. Dan has actually confirmed, I think unknowingly, our findings. However, EX, he believes is something else. I believe exemplar is the most appropriate interpretation of what that means. Exemplar means kind of a final draft copy from which others will be created. This is the final version. Now let's go ahead and print it.
Right. So, the indication here is as altered in pencil. So it's, Willard Richards is saying, I've gone through this. I've made my final corrections in pencil. And this is what we go to the presses with, right?
The key date
is August 7th, 1852, which is just 3 weeks,
22 days
before it's
prior to the announcement.
Announced.
That's right. That's something to pay attention to. We have a different version that's materially different from the Kingsbury copy in material ways that change meaning. That Willard Richards then goes in and edits. All of those edits make their way into the or are in the Kingsbury copy. We're arguing they make their way into the Kingsbury copy. Nothing the other way around. That's interesting. So we have a draft, what appears to be a draft, in Willard Richards' handwriting.
Yep. And, I have to give credit to you for most of this slide right here. So your viewers should be familiar with this information, right? That it was altered in pencil 3 weeks before. And we know that on subsequent weeks after this August 7th date, that senior church leaders, including Brigham Young and Willard Richards, met to hear the revelation read aloud and to discuss it. That's based on a paper from...
I can't remember his name.
Whitaker.
It's called The Bone in the Throat.
The Bone in the Throat.
Yep, that's right.
So
excellent paper. And
look at that.
He goes to the Church History Office Journal. And
So anyway, so this shows to me that there is a possibility, there again, not conclusive, there is a possibility that Willard Richards had some hand in the development of the language that we have as Section 132 today.
Well, the parsimonious explanation for the Richards copy is that it's earlier. That is the more reasonable, we argue, the more reasonable interpretation. When you have a dozen edits to a document, many of which change meaning in substantive ways, they make their way into the Kingsbury copy, and nothing goes the other way around. When you have the Kingsbury copy that has problems in and of itself, it was not done in a single sitting. It was done at least 2 sittings, contrary to Kingsbury's story. So if you haven't, by the way, done a deep dive, go back and watch the episode on the Revelation, and that will help you as you read Adrian's paper really understand the import of what he's saying here, because it's incredibly important.
Thanks. Back to this book. So this is an interesting shift that I've seen recently in some of the podcasts and things around here. So this in William Smith's book, again, he says the revelation was not intended for public circulation. It was because of Hiram's persuasion and enthusiasm the text was produced and subsequently distributed. So this has been something I think maybe in the Faith Matters recent thing. Did they talk about this, where it wasn't ever intended to be anything except a revelation between Joseph and Emma, right? It was a private thing, and it shouldn't have ever been released in the way that it was.
And that's speculative. That's combining William Clayton's statement about the story of Hiram coming, which conflicts with his own journal. However, that's where he's getting that from, or William Clayton's 1874 affidavit.
Right. So, I've got a list of questions here that kind of follow with that. So if Joseph Smith received the revelation as it's now written, printed in the Doctrine and Covenants, why didn't he publish it? Would he ever have published it? And did he have a plan for rolling it out? If he was practicing it in secret, he couldn't go on doing that indefinitely, right?
According to the women, they were told, well, this will be open. Joseph will be able to talk about this later. You will be acknowledged as a wife later. So that was part of the story they were being told.
Yeah. But it never happened, right? So his public stance up until his death, we know from May 1844, June 1844, he was denying it, right? A few weeks before his death, that city council meeting, he was denying it. So if his public stance was denial and it was never intended for public consumption, why did the church then publish it and adopt it, right? What was the motivation behind that, right? It's an interesting question to ask. And if he didn't receive it as it's now written, where did it come from? Could it be an amalgamation of different revelations or, and different authors? Could some be from Joseph Smith and some from other sources? And could Richards have influenced it in any way? I think it's pretty sure that he influenced it in some way. We don't know the extent of that. And once again, if it was not intended for public circulation, why then did it become part of the church? All right, so we're at the point here where we've gone through the 5 sources that articulate the divine reversal, and that is really with my paper. It ended up being maybe a third of the paper, which when I thought it was going to be the majority of the paper, but through the peer review process, they came back and said, well, what about this? What about this? And we've talked about some of it. What about Nephi and Laban? What about Abraham? And what about the biggest what about is Jacob chapter 2, verse 30, right? And so in my paper, I spend a good amount of time showing how, at least in Joseph Smith's time, nobody was using Jacob 2:30 as it's used today, as an exception clause, as a reversal clause. And I have several different sources that talk about that. In the interest of time today, I'm just going to cut it down to one. Brian Hales was asked, did Joseph Smith use Jacob 2:30 to justify plural marriage? And he's quoted as saying, it's interesting to note, according to all available documents, Joseph Smith never referred to Jacob 2:30 to justify the restoration of plural marriage. Undoubtedly, later voices have done so. And again, he said, I just did another search of my Joseph Smith polygamy manuscripts and some other databases. No one quotes Joseph Smith as referring to the Book of Mormon and Jacob 2:30 to justify his introduction of plural marriage. So, if the viewers want more information on this, I would recommend Steve Reed's article. I think it's probably the best treatment that I've read on why Jacob 2:30 isn't a loophole.
Where can they find that?
So it's his blog is called One Climbs.
One Climbs, that's right.
Steve Reed.
Excellent.
Why Jacob 2:30 is not a loophole or something like that. If you go to my paper, it's cited in there, and there should be a link that'll take you to if you can't, just search for One Climbs, Steve Reed, Jacob chapter 2. So I would encourage people to go to that. Again, this is kind of the end of where I'm going to cover what I had in my paper. But I just want to say, I want to give a little bit of grace to Willard Richards. Like I said at the beginning, he was part of a new religion with new ideas. He had to construct a narrative from thousands of sources and evolving teachers and a drastic change at some point that he had to come somehow make it fit, right? Yeah. But if Joseph Smith if he never taught divine reversal, which I'm arguing that he didn't, he never gave a clear rollout plan. Or wait a second. If he was teaching it, he never gave a rollout plan as to how it was to be implemented. And if he wasn't teaching it, it might have been confusing to not just Willard, but everyone around him as to where that line was drawn, like we talked about at the beginning. He kind of came right up to it in what I could find, but he never really reversed morality in any way, right? So I am choosing to give grace to Willard. I don't, until I see more compelling evidence, I'm not going to say that he was part of some secret cabal that was conniving and, I don't know. And I'm withholding judgment up to this point, right?
It's possible that he interpreted things Joseph Smith was saying through the lens of his own personal revelation or in his conversations with Heber and Brigham, because they appear at least to be simpatico in this,
right,
this understanding.
Yeah. And like we said at the beginning, he was not near Joseph, at the beginning of his time in the church. So much of his foundational ideas may have been warped or corrupted by what was happening in England, as you've talked about quite a lot.
Yeah, most of his time with Joseph, the closest time came after that formative experience in England.
Yeah.
So if you come back from being with Heber Kimball and Brigham Young, and Heber Kimball is teaching you the spiritual wife doctrine, do we know that happened to Willard Richards? We don't know for sure. But Heber Kimball was teaching it. That's for sure. On his mission, he was talking about it prior to his mission. If he's teaching that prior to Joseph supposedly introducing anything, and they have a profound experience when Brigham Young says, the Spirit came on me in such a way that I'll never forget. He gained a personal witness, a testimony he called it the spiritual wife doctrine in England.
Yeah.
So if these men are having this experience, and if Heber Kimball is having the experience and such that he is practicing it with Ellen Redmond, these men have a witness of it as part, and Heber connects it to the fullness of the gospel. He connects it to the law that leads to the celestial worlds. He does that in 1841, February 1841. So this is prior to all this. He comes back, and now his time with Joseph Smith, imagine he's got a witness of the principle. He's writing about it to Janetta. And now let's say Joseph never says a word. He could still read into Joseph's words as saying, well, that's what he's talking about.
Right. Yeah. In my paper, I actually go through some of that. There's actually another letter that predates everything we talked about today from November 7th of 1841, where there's a sermon from Joseph. And I won't go into much of it, but we have three recordings of this letter. And there's one from Willard Richards where he records the sermon from Joseph Smith. And in his version, he inserts some of these ideas. He doesn't insert the full divine reversal, but this idea, that the question that sometimes God sometimes says, thou shalt not kill, but other times he says, to Abraham to kill Isaac, right? So there's this question in his mind, how is he trying to connect those things together? And so Willard is writing a letter to his brother telling what Joseph said in his speech. And he says that Joseph said all these things about thou shalt not kill and Abraham and Isaac and so forth. But nobody else who recorded that sermon recorded those same things. So to me, it seems like Joseph might have said something that triggered this internal philosophy, and he kind of overlaid that on whatever Joseph was teaching. And again, I'm speculating just like anybody else is, but that's the way I read this is, and another interesting thing in that letter is, Willard says to his brother that he's wholly incapacitated to be able to give an accurate recollection of what Joseph said. So I don't know what that means, but it's kind of interesting. I don't know, was he asleep? Was he drunk? Yeah, I don't know. But so he's wholly incapacitated to give an accurate recollection of the meeting, but somehow he's reading in these things that are kind of the hints to the divine reversal stuff back in 1841. So to me, it feels like, this was something that he had internalized. He had these, even these phrases that you see repeated, unless the Lord direct otherwise. And, God commands, thou shalt not kill, but Abraham, killed Isaac, or, sometimes God says to destroy everybody or whatever. So it feels to me like he had this kind of soapbox, it was that was his thing, like this divine reversal. This is how I justify what I'm doing in my mind. And I see that everywhere. So
very interesting.
This is very much speculation as I'm saying, but that's kind of the way I have interpreted it, what I'm seeing in his writings, because it's very interesting that every time we only see it come through Willard Richards' pen.
Wow. I think one of the biggest takeaways from this conversation for me, and something I've thought about quite a bit, is I think we make a lot of assumptions. We read into the history things that because of stories that were told later, and we just superimpose them on Joseph Smith as though they're just fact. For example, his closest inner circle. Okay. Were they really that close? There are other stories that would contradict that. Like, for example, William Smith would say, now he's, to the Brigham Young narrative, he's certainly antagonistic, but he would say that Joseph Smith had trouble with Brigham Young.
Right.
At the very end of Joseph's life, Emma came. This is a story from William Smith, and they sat down to dinner a couple weeks before the martyrdom. And Emma said, hey, we've got John Taylor, Willard Richards, and Brigham Young going around teaching things that are going to ruin the church. And William said they were talking about polygamy. And Joseph looked at Emma. They said they're at breakfast. And Joseph looked at Emma and said, I'll deal with them as soon as I get through with the Laws and Fosters, the expositor people. And he said, according to William, this is William saying what Emma said, so we got to take that for what it's worth, that Joseph said that I think I'll have particular trouble with Brigham Young. Okay, well, can we entertain that those things are possible, or is only one side of the picture correct? And we have lots from Emma, lots from William, lots from from Joseph Smith III and others who would give us that side of the story. But are we only to superimpose on the narrative the other stories that happened decades after the fact? When you have nothing in the contemporaneous history, nothing that is reliable, and we are talking also about William Clayton. So if you're just watching this for the first time, you're gonna have to watch the other things we talk about William Clayton. There's nothing in the contemporaneous history that we can anchor to. So we have these anomalies that pop up. They're all in the handwriting of one guy. I think we ought to stop and pay attention. And I think that's the brilliance of your paper. It gets us to focus on something. You're the first person to articulate this pattern, all connected to Willard Richards. So I am really, really grateful that you spent the time on that and you put it in such an elegant way that really helps us have a unique and different understanding.
Thanks. It was fun to do. So, I don't know, do we want to keep going with the last bit?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think this type of thing naturally leads to the question, well, what does this mean for the church today? That's, in any of the things that are being surfaced in this exploration that's being done by many people, most members of the church and others say, well, what does this particular thing mean for the church today? And I don't want to imply or assume what it might mean for the church today, but I do want to ask the question, what does the doctrine of divine reversal mean for us today? Is it, it's recorded in the church. It's, unfortunately, because of that situation where the happiness letter made it into the history of the church and then the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, it has sometimes, whatever God requires is right has been said over the pulpit in general conference. It's been taught as Joseph Smith said this, right? And so you might hear it in your elders quorum lesson or your Sunday school lesson, And the question is that a doctrine that we believe in? And what are the implications thereof? So, just kind of jokingly, are the 10 Commandments literally written in stone, or are they like the pirate code that's more like guidelines than actual rules, right? And, I just wanted to dig into this just a little bit, just to, mainly just to help people think through it, right? So, Elder Neil L. Anderson gave a talk in General Conference where he says that there's an important principle that governs the doctrine of the church. The doctrine is taught by all 15 members of the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12. It's not hidden in an obscure paragraph of one talk. True principles are taught frequently and by many. Our doctrine is not difficult to find. So if the divine reversal was a doctrine of the church, it should be found, by, being taught by multiple members of the church frequently, right? But I did a little bit of digging. So there's a very cool website, if people aren't aware of it. It's called the General Conference Corpus, I think it's called.
Yes.
Where you can search for words and phrases through all General Conference talks from, I think, 1851 till the present time. So I did a search just for the word polygamy. And it comes up, decade by decade, how many times that word was referenced. You can click on it, and then it'll show you the context of when that was mentioned. So since 1998, the word polygamy has been mentioned in General Conference one time. And that was by Elder Ballard. And the context was he just mentioned it as this was a practice that was practiced by a few 170 years ago, and it was discontinued. That was basically the essence of that. Now, if you go back to 1998, you'll find President Gordon B. Hinckley, who actually had quite a lot to say about polygamy. He mentioned it on many occasions in the negative, right? And we'll get to that here in a second. But I also searched for whatever God requires of right. So I didn't do an extensive search, but I thought, okay, what about this phrase that's from the happiness letter that's pretty succinct in that's the divine reversal. Whatever God requires is right. And I found one mention of it by a 70, not by anyone in the form of the 12 apostles or the First Presidency since 1988, one time in 38-year time span where a divine reversal was mentioned in General Conference. So that leads to the question, is this a concept that we should believe in? Is this a doctrine of the church? And if it is, how does that jive with the teaching that I outlined at the beginning from the lectures on faith that says that if God is changing, that we can't have faith in him because it introduces doubt. So if divine reversal is a concept of the church, if at some point, whether it's in this life or the next life, God again changes his mind and says, all right, now it's again time to live polygamy, how can we have faith in that God, knowing that could happen at any period in time, right? That's a question that needs to be dealt with. I'm not saying one way or the other, but the silence on the subject is glaring, right? We don't really know what the doctrine of the LDS Church is on this subject. So we have podcasters, historians, and anesthesiologists saying that monogamy is the rule and polygamy is the exception. But interestingly enough, that little couplet, that phrase, has never been taught over the pulpit at General Conference, right? So that is not a doctrine that is plainly taught frequently by
that's a philosophy of men,
right? This is
mingled with Scripture.
It's an explanation. It's a faithful, trying to be faithful explanation that's been concocted. And you actually, if you look, there's a Michelle Stone did kind of some episodes on Keith Erickson, who's a church historian, outreach type of person, and he actually says in his talk that was recorded that it was the church historians department that came up with that couplet. That monogamy is the rule, that polygamy is the exception. So it's not, that is not divine doctrine. It is something that men came up with to explain the situation, right? Similarly, these same people say that God will never force you to be in a relationship that you don't want to be in. And that's very comforting to women who have broken hearts or who worry that they might have to share their husband at some point. It's comforting to be told that you will never be forced into a relationship that you want to be in. But again, that's never been taught over the pulpit by the Q15, as we call them, right? And again, so then there's a contradiction here where President Hinckley did declare once on national television that polygamy is not doctrinal. He said that exact phrase, not doctrinal. But that declaration is discounted because it wasn't over the General Conference pulpit and it was only said one time. So this silence and ambiguity leads to doubts and confusion for everybody. So I kind of like to point out the absurdity of thing like that Taylor Swift thing. So I came up with a proposed, if divine reversal is a doctrine of the church, I propose that we add an article of faith that says, we believe that whatsoever God commands is right, though it overturn all former commandments, and that obedience to present revelation sanctifieth that which was once morally egregious. So that's kind of like the absurdity of the whole thing. Is this something that we could accept as and that's what the divine reversal is. Is that something we accept? When
you put it in that language, it suddenly comes into stark relief.
Yeah. So those are my comments on divine reversal. I have one more topic and then a conclusion. I don't know if you want.
No, I'd like
keep
to.
going.
Yes, please.
I didn't know if you had any more comments on divine reversal before we move away from that. But
please go read his paper. All of the sourcing is easily accessible. And it's excellently sourced, and I think it's so worth your time. If you're struggling with this conversation, take some time and ponder what he's saying, because I think it's so important to ask ourselves: did this come from Joseph Smith or not? The assumption is there by many, but I think you have made the case that there's room to say we ought to rethink this.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Yes, let's continue.
All right, just we're in the home stretch here. The other thing I wanted to address is this idea. So the standard narrative says that Joseph Smith was teaching and practicing the doctrine of plural marriage in secret, while at the same time publicly denying it. And that's the accepted narrative by the church. That's what the ex-Mormons say, that those for and against, the apologists and the enemies, everyone says that this is the narrative. This is what was happening, that it was happening in secret, but being denied in public. So this again leads to a question as to what does that mean for the church today? Is this secret revelation and public denial, is that something that we still believe in, right? Could the prophet today command a secret group of people to do one thing while disavowing and condemning it in public? And I would make the argument that if that's the case, there's a very good chance that the fundamentalist sects are not wrong today, because their story is exactly that story. Their story is that the president of the church, Prophet John Taylor, gathered a group of men and secretly taught them that polygamy should never be taken from the earth. And they were empowered and enlisted to maintain that practice until Christ comes again, and that they were to practice it in secret, but the church would deny it publicly, right? So
Excellent point.
So, fundamentalism is all over the place right now, right? With the documentary on Netflix, with the Trust Me, right?
Yes.
So if we believe that this is something that could happen in the doctrine of the church, it's very possible that this is sanctioned behavior, right? That at least
It's
when
possible
it broke off,
that
right?
they're coordinating with, technically possible, they're coordinating with either just God or God and the leaders of our church.
Right. And, to be clear, I don't want to say that this is what I believe,
that
right?
leaves the possibility.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is if this is a principle that we believe in, that faithfully Joseph could have been secretly doing it because of the risks or dangers or whatever excuse we want to make, but publicly deny it, that opens the door to all kinds of crazy things. I thought of another example. So Elizabeth Smart was recently in the news. I can't remember why, but a lot of people don't remember or even know that Brian David Mitchell, her kidnapper, wrote a manifesto saying that he had been commanded by God to take plural wives, and Elizabeth Smart was the first one of those wives, and he had planned to kidnap others. Right now, this is, I'm pushing this to the extreme here, of course, but if Brian David Mitchell had said in his manifesto, rather than the God telling him to do it, is say he had met the prophet on the streets of Salt Lake at one time, and the prophet told him to do that. If he said that, we wouldn't have, if we believe in secret revelations and public denials, we would have no idea or no way of knowing that what he is saying is true or not, right? Because the church could command something in private, but deny it in public. Now, again, I'm going to the extreme here, right?
There's no evidence. We're not saying that happened.
I'm not saying that happened, but that's what we're talking. The point is so valid because this is just not something.
This is the moral predicament that you're describing.
It's the problem with the narrative, right? This narrative cannot stand. We cannot accept that the faithful narrative of the church is secret revelations and public denials.
Well, and the argument is the secret revelation and public denials was actually practiced by the likes, I'm sorry, of John Taylor, for example, who in 1850 had something along the lines of, I don't know, it was 12 to 16 wives. I don't know the exact number. It was well over 10 wives at that point, and he's in France, and he's asked very publicly, so you practice this horrible thing called polygamy? And he said, no, we don't. No, we do not, basically. Wagged his finger, if you will, and stood up and read from the Doctrine and Covenants, said, this is the only law of our church. And he read the article on marriage. And he said, how dare you, sir, say that we practice these abominations? He called it an abomination. Mm-hmm. And at that very time, he was doing that very thing. And then the leaders of the church would go back east and publicly proclaim that it was all a lie, all up until August 29th, 1852. They were lying about it publicly from Joseph Smith's death all the way up to that point. And they justified it as having been necessary in order to be able to go west and to set themselves up. So this is not without foundation that early church leaders did. And then, of course, they would not tell the truth at various times. Brian Hales was backed into a corner by Steve Pinecker to say, well, what about the post-manifesto polygamy? What about that? They didn't tell the truth about that. And they demonstrably did not tell the truth about that. Joseph F. Smith lied to Congress about that. And after 1890, they continued to practice it for 14 years. And even after the second manifesto, there was plural marriage occurring after that. So this is with merit. This idea that at various times, church leaders have not told the truth about these things. This has not been fully the concept of lying for the Lord. Scholars have written about this. This occurred in the history. The question is, did Joseph do it? We assume he did because the others did. That's the crux of the matter. And in order to believe that Joseph did, we have to believe the very people who themselves lied about it. And I think you're putting us into, you're putting us into a crucible where we have to sit and reconcile this. We have to ask ourselves these very, very hard questions. So I'm so appreciative. I mean, this is such a stark example. If Joseph Smith had commanded, this guy back then to kidnap women, right? If Joseph Smith had done it, let's fast forward. Who was the president of the church at the time? Was it Hinckley at the time? I think it was Hinckley.
Not sure.
Boy, that is such a relevant question that we all have to reconcile.
Yeah, I kind of like to, to bring it to something, in our day that's connected or
and we don't think about
analogous.
the Elizabeth Smart thing in terms of polygamy, but that's exactly what it was.
Exactly what it was. There's a manifesto that was that tied it directly to polygamy. So, all right. So I have another proposed article of faith, number 15. We believe the Lord may command his people to practice in private that which they deny in public, and that such contradiction is justified when done in obedience to his will.
That's exactly the lying for the Lord principle. Thank you. That's it. Wow.
Okay, so I'm ready to wrap this up. Are we good? I'll wrap it up. So,
yes. And then I have one more final question for you.
Okay. I want the viewers to know, like we started out, I'm a faithful member of the church. And I care about my membership in the church. I acknowledge that I may be putting myself at risk coming here with the situations. But so I wanted to just touch on why, with all this knowledge and these revelations, why do I choose to stay in the church? And if you permit me, I'd like to just talk about that a little bit.
Please do.
I wanted to talk about it just using two parables. First is the parable of the wheat and the tares. So I don't think we need to read it necessarily. You can look it up in Matthew 13. But the kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man who sowed good seed in his field. And while he slept, an enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. So the seeds grow together. They recognize there's some tares there, and the servants say, "Should we tear it out?" And the master says, "No, let's leave it there, because if you tear it out now, then it'll destroy everything." So they let them both grow together, and then at harvest time, they're separated, and the wheat is gathered. So to me, polygamy is a fulfillment of this prophecy, right? The wheat and the tares. The tare of polygamy was sown into the restoration of the church at that first night, at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so to me, a lot of people say, well, what does this have to, what are the ramifications? What does it mean? If Joseph didn't do it and Brigham did it, what does it mean for the church, for the line of authority, all this stuff? And to me, I look at it completely differently. It's not, I don't focus on, the line of authority and that type of thing. I'm saying, well, if we didn't have a tare, would this be the kingdom of God? Would the restoration be true? Yeah. It's prophesied that there are going to be tares amongst the wheat. And to me, this is a manifestation of that thing. So
we shouldn't say all is well in Zion.
Right.
We should look for the fact that signs of it being true are that there's opposition.
Right. And the fact that there is a tare amongst the wheat means that there's something about the restoration that has some significance, right?
I love that thought.
So my other parable is Jacob chapter 5. So this is the allegory of the olive tree, which is, very commonly known to be, an allegory of the scattering and gathering of Israel. But as we know, parables have multiple meanings. And my wife and I have taken this parable to have some implications, again, with polygamy and the restoration of the gospel. And in verse 46, it says, "Behold, notwithstanding all the care which we have taken of my vineyard, the trees thereof have become corrupted, that they bring forth no good fruit. And these I'd hoped to preserve, and laid up fruit against the season unto mine own self. But behold, they have become like unto the wild olive tree, and they are of no worth, but to be hewn down and cast into the fire, and it grieveth me that I should lose them." So we're in, it gets, there's all this, grafting and pruning and digging and moving branches here and there, wild branches and good branches. But at some point, everything is corrupted, and the master wants to tear it all down. So I'm not here to say that, everything is corrupted in the church. But what I am here to say is that it's possible that corruption can enter. And for me, the next verses are what helps me. It says, "Behold, the servant said unto the Lord of the vineyard, spare it a little longer. Wherefore go to and call servants, that we may labor diligently with our might in the vineyard, that we may prepare the way, that I may bring forth again the natural fruit, which natural fruit is good and the most precious above all other fruit." So there's another verse I didn't copy, but it talks about them going to gather servants, and there's just a few of them that do it, but they are eventually able to restore the natural fruit. And I don't want to, take this meaning, I just want people to understand that this is why I choose to stay and serve in the church. I find that it's the best place, that I found, like I said, to raise a family. I love the community. I love the opportunities for service. I was thinking the other day, walking through the neighborhood, I wouldn't know any of these people if I wasn't a member of a community that cares about each other and serves one another. And, I talked about missions. I love missions. I love so many things about the church and the vineyard. And I think it's worth saving. And I think it's worth working to, but at the same time, I feel like, in order for the church as a tool to help us to have faith unto God, for salvation, like we talked about from the lectures on faith, in order for it to be that, it has to be founded on truth. So, and that's why we'll go back once again to, that's why I care about this, that I want to know the truth wherever it may take me, and that can help everyone better have faith in God and bring us back to salvation, which is everybody's goal.
My goodness, I appreciate that so much. Wow. Well, first of all, I think you're very, very brave. Given the climate that we're in, where understandably, I understand why people are afraid of the topic, because it brings up questions that you've talked a little bit about. What does this mean for this, that, and the other? What does it mean for my eternal family? I think all of those things can be addressed, but I'm so appreciative. I think that your paper is incredibly important, and I hope everyone will read it. I'd like to end here just with one final question. Can you tell the audience what it has done for you personally, in your mind, in your heart, in your spirit, to abandon the doctrine of many wives and concubines, which is the doctrine? It's not the doctrine of plural marriage. It's the doctrine of many wives and concubines. That's what it says. What's that done for you? What's that done for your relationship with your wife? And what's that done for your relationship with the Lord?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I would say it's been transformational. It's been life-changing. As I've let go of this, it feels like there's so many things. It feels like I understand scriptures better, that I can see what their true intent was. I feel more desire to learn about the gospel, to develop my relationship with the Savior. Like I say, it feels like, I'm trying to remember. I think we were reading scriptures with my family the other day, and there was a scripture that talked about blindness. It's talked about blindness. That word is used in the Book of Mormon quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And my wife just made a comment that word hits a little differently now. I think all of us have been blinded by this doctrine, and once we let go of it, it's amazing. How much different, how different I feel. How more free and more connected with God. I feel like I think about God and the Savior, in my daily life way more than I did previously. And not.
Why do you think that is?
I don't really know. It just feels like it's just, it feels like that they're closer in some way.
Do you feel like you've partnered with God in this endeavor in some form?
I hope so. There are times when I feel like, certain things I've done or said or written, feels inspired, that it came from God. I feel like I've been directed in some way, but if I'm going to be honest, I have to say I also have some doubts, at times because of the standard narrative, because of the environment of people getting excommunicated, and this restriction on thought and speech. It makes you nervous, and it makes you second guess. Am I doing the right thing?
What would Uchtdorf say?
Yeah,
he would say,
right.
Check out your doubts and see where they're coming from.
So, so I do have this kind of constant battle, but I think it is because of, if people, were more open to discussing problems and not having this doomsday scenario. I saw these video clips from, I think it was Jacob Hansen and Greg Madsen, where they're talking about, well, if Joseph Smith didn't do it and Brigham did it, then that means that he wasn't a prophet, and that his, all of the prophets after him were not, didn't have authority. And this whole, house of cards domino effect, like if this is this, then all of this means this, and it's like this doomsday scenario. Dogs and cats are living together, you know. And I just don't see it that way. I think if we can have open discussion and really find what the truth is, then everybody's better off. You know, then our faith can increase. You know, if we don't have the faith in the right thing, it's, you know, I wish I could remember what that quote was from the lectures on faith. You know, it's unprofitable for us, you know, if our faith is in the wrong God, right? So to have faith in the correct God, to know that he is not going to suddenly change his mind for no apparent reason or no explanation, no reason that has a good explanation. To know that just has increased my faith and helped me to feel closer to him. So that's me personally. As far as my marriage goes, again, it's again just it feels like we took a leap. You know, that it feels like we're so in sync. We're closer together. There isn't, you know, I don't know that there was any like conscious or you know, palatable feeling of like a wedge between us before. Nothing that, you know, that I would have noticed at the time. But now that we have this understanding, it feels like there was something there that has been removed, right? That, you know, for better or worse, you know, we're there for each other for eternity, right? And you can,
is it conscious that, wow, now we can actually really give ourselves to each other? Is that something that
I think at times we haven't talked about that. You know, we talk a lot about things around this. And so,
but not as it pertains to the two of you.
Yeah, you know, I'm not a like kind of share my feelings kind of guy, so I wouldn't really ever say like, now we can really, you know, give ourselves to each other.
Maybe you should.
I know, but she knows it. But
the specter is no longer hanging over you.
Yeah, you know, she like before it was something that she let sneak out a few times, and it was larger than I ever knew, and it doesn't hang over her. And you know, there's so many things. You know, I could go on and on about how much damage this does to the men of the church. And you know, just one little anecdote, you know, I was in an elders quorum meeting not too long ago where the teacher got up and you know, just kind of as his intro to his thing. He's like, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and he's not a member of the church, and he found out that I was, you know, a Mormon. And his two questions were, why don't you drink coffee, and how many wives do you have? And everybody in the room just kind of, you know, did that awkward,
the nervous chuckle.
Yep. You're like, ha ha ha, polygamy is so funny, you know? Yeah. And that really hit much different to me now than it ever has. You know, that's like, we're sitting in elders quorum laughing at this thing that is causing heartache and pain to the women sitting in Relief Society. And so I'm just glad to be free of that. And, you know, I want to do what I can do to help people understand that that's not a principle that we should entertain or laugh about.
Do you still believe in eternal marriage?
I do. Yeah.
So it doesn't have to destroy the belief in that doctrine that you and your wife can be married forever.
Yeah. And to me, that's like the most silly argument. You know, that's like one of the desperate attempts to say, well, if we were to decanonize, and again, I'm not advocating that. I'm saying if that were to happen, if we were to decanonize 132, people say, well, that would get rid of eternal marriage, you know, because that's the only place that we have it. And then first of all, that's not the only place that we have it. It's all over the place. You know, it's Joseph Smith did teach that. And, you know, there's, you know, it's just a dumb argument because there are so many things that we do in the church that are not found in canonized scripture. So if you can't make that argument, right? And there's so many things that have, you know, like the article on marriage, you know, the section 101, you know, if we put it back, then we're talking about marriage being done in the view of eternity, right?
Yes.
Is that celestial marriage? Yeah, it is, right?
That's right.
So, you know, even if we got rid of 132, we still have 101 that
you could rely on his statements from July 16th. You can rely on his on his statements in 1835. So,
So to say that, you know, getting rid of 132, get rid of plural or of celestial marriage, I think that's just a silly excuse that, you know, it's like a desperate attempt. You know, we got to say something. So
well, it sounds like you're able to navigate the challenging questions. And I think it's really important that when Latter-day Saints, faithful, active Latter-day Saints, when they are convicted in their heart that this is not something that's from God or something that he wants them to believe in, if they feel to speak, I think it's important when they do. And I'm so grateful that you've decided to do that you've gone through the arduous work of putting a paper together, that you've shared this with the audience. Boy, this has been an incredible conversation, and you've given so much material for the audience to think about. And I am so grateful to you, Adrian. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thank you.
That concludes my conversation with Adrian Croft. I want to thank him for his tremendous research and taking the time to help me and all of us understand our history a little better. Thanks to all of you who support the show. Links are below if you want to join and support us. Don't forget to subscribe, like, leave a comment. Until next time, thanks for stopping by.